Wild Man in Tennessee. From Anonymous. My father has always hunted, ever since I can remember. He never had less than 2 or 3 hounds at a time. These days, I guess you could say he's retired from the sport. His legs won't let him travel the woods the way he used to. Now he owns a few small feists and hunts the occasional squirrel. In his youth, however, there's not much ground in the mountains of Tennessee that he hasn't covered. Now, everyone says that if you're in the woods long enough, there comes a day that you will finally see something. For Tennessee, there have been stories and rumors of mountain lions and pumas that live high in these mountains. Anyone who has hunted much of their lives here will tell you that there are things in these woods that only a few men have seen. My father, however, believes that one night he and 2 other men he was hunting with ran into a wild man. This figure has been called such. We've all heard of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Ape Man. My father is unsure what the true term should be for what they found. He and a cousin and uncle went on a late hunt one night. They gathered their dogs, loaded the trucks, and set out into the woods. He recalls that they had been hunting for a little over an hour when the dogs appeared to be barking up on a ridge. When you coon hunt, you turn your dogs loose and follow close by until they give you a good loud call, letting you know they have a tree. When my dad heard the dogs, he told his cousin he was going to walk around the ridge and see if they were coming from that direction. His cousin decided to walk straight up the ridge to see if the dogs might be at the top. About 30 minutes later, they all met back up, and my dad says he remembers the look on his cousin's face. His cousin was pale white and looked as if he had been scared by something. When they got him to calm down, he told them what he had encountered at the top of the ridge. He said he had made it to the top and spotted one of the dogs. It seemed to be whining, and then it took off in another direction, tail tucked. He said he had wondered what was making the dog so nervous when he heard a crunch about 20 feet in front of him. When he looked up, he could only stare. Nothing was making a sound. The woods had gone dead silent. Standing only 20 feet away was a sight he could not even believe. He said it stood taller than a 6-foot man. The hair on the thing was an inch long and black as coal. The eyes looked almost human and were what he described as wild eyes. The thing had an angry look to its face that would make anyone want to run. It was standing next to a tree on its hind legs like a man. Its arms hung to its sides, and its fingertips were nearly to its knees. When he saw its hands, he found long red nails that came out from the fingers. As for the smell, he described it as skunk-like. It almost took his breath away. What scared him the most was the growl that came from this thing. He said it was almost like a man's yell combined with a roar. That broke him out of his shock, and he began wondering if this thing was going to charge him. He had no gun with him at the time. He was the only one out of the 3 who was not armed, and he knew he was alone unless he could reach the bottom of the ridge. He saw a log lying on the ground and decided against running, afraid that showing fear towards it would only make this thing turn on him. He picked up the log and began beating a nearby tree, screaming at the thing as loud as he could, praying for a miracle. All at once, the thing turned and ran away back into the trees. When asked later if he believed he scared it, He would deny this, saying he doubted something that big was afraid of him, but rather it didn't really care to approach him, or maybe it didn't see a need to. He would claim that anything that big probably didn't see many creatures as a threat. After the beast had turned, he told them he had ran as fast as he possibly could back down the ridge, in case it changed its mind and decided to come back. By this time, they had located the dogs, but none of their dogs seemed thrilled any longer to be in those woods. They simply stayed tucked under the men's feet, whining with their tails between their legs. They decided to take the dogs back to the truck. After loading up the dogs, my dad suggested they go back in and see if they found anything else. The cousin was resilient to enter the woods again, but was soon convinced, as now they were together and had guns. They began walking back to the area where the cousin had encountered the thing. After walking for a while, a stench filled the air. My dad would describe it as a soiled, yeast-like smell. Said it was like the worst body odor or skunk smell you would ever experience. They continued walking until they thought they were surrounded by this smell. That's when they noticed the ground. There were leaves and grass mounded and piled around on the ground. He said it looked like some sort of nesting or bed. The smell even seemed to linger on the mound, and they imagined maybe the thing slept here. That's when they found hair matted into some of the leaves. They picked up some of that hair, and just like the cousin's story, that hair was black too. My dad said you could smell the stench on the hair. It was then they heard a growl. It echoed and seemed to be pretty far from them. Even so, they all decided now was the time to go. They all turned and ran back to the trucks. They were finally making their way to the road and didn't say anything as they all climbed back into the trucks, speeding away. My dad says he never saw the thing his cousin described. In some ways, he wanted to know what it was his cousin had seen. He asked this cousin what he believed it had been. Man or beast, it was obvious the cousin had been terrified. From the description they were given, my dad and his uncle wonder if rather than some Bigfoot or Sasquatch legend, there was another explanation. Could it have been a wild man? My dad says the cousin described it as being tall, but just over 6 feet, and it was built and stood a lot like a man, and the eyes were described as human. There was no glowing or imaginary horns like some of the things we've heard about when told of Bigfoot. This seemed raw and wild, but also very human-like too. Either way, there's one lingering question that is always asked. I asked the question to my dad as well. Why is it that we don't ever get good pictures? Why is it out of 3 men, no one that night decided to take some of the hair? Why is it that we only have these stories? Their answer? Fear stopped them. Whatever it was, this thing could hurt a man. My dad does have his regrets about simply leaving, but worries what could have happened had they stayed. This never stopped my dad from enjoying a good hunting trip. For years he would continue to hunt the mountains of Tennessee, and he has never seen this creature himself. But if what his cousin described that night was true, we may in fact have our own Sasquatch or wild man, or whatever it might be, right here in our cozy mountains of Tennessee. Camping Trip from Kathryn CC. A few months ago, my best friend invited me to go on a camping trip with her family. I obviously said yes, knowing that her brother would be there. I had and still have a huge crush on him. I packed up my stuff and said goodbye to my family. Then they picked me up. The trip was only for the weekend, but a lot can happen in 2 days. We went to a campsite that was an hour away from our town. The sun was setting by the time we got there. Now, this campsite was very popular and had a bunch of people in different parts of the woods, all of whom seemed very friendly and private. We got our tents set up, and I luckily shared a tent with my friend and her brother. This was around September, so it was freezing at night. There was a bathroom, but we would have to walk to it, which would take about 15 minutes there and back. I very stupidly did not come prepared for the cold at all. All I had was a pair of sort of fuzzy pants and a short-sleeved shirt as my PJs. I know, very dumb. Anyway, every time I had to go to the bathroom or my friend had to go, we would have to go together. One night I woke up around 1 a.m. I really had to use the bathroom. It was around 24 degrees, which was really bad for me. I really didn't want to walk to the bathroom for 15 minutes in that kind of cold. I considered doing my business outside the tent, but I was scared that someone would wake up and see me doing it. I pretty much had no choice, so I decided to walk to the bathroom. I looked at my friend. She looked so comfy and warm, so I decided to go alone. Another very, very stupid decision for me. I wrapped my friend's super fuzzy blanket around me, put my shoes on, and walked out of the tent. The second I went outside, I felt like an icicle. My face felt numb. I shook it off and started walking. It was so dark I could barely see anything, and I started to feel scared. I was about 8 minutes into walking, so I couldn't just turn back now. I walked for a little bit more until I heard a twig snap on the very left of me. I shot my head over and held up my lantern to see if it was just a person. But there was no one there. I brushed it off and thought maybe it was an animal. I kept walking until suddenly I heard leaves crunching behind me. I stopped and I turned around, and the crunching stopped too. Shakily, I held up my lantern again to see if I was being followed. There was no one in sight. I tried walking again, but I heard leaves crunching once more. My heart was racing, and I started to run as fast as I could. I could hear something running behind me, after me. Luckily for me, I was fast enough, as I could soon see the lights of the bathroom. I've never been so happy to see a bathroom in my life. I ran inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it. I was breathing so hard, I was terrified. I walked over to the mirror to look at my face. My cheeks were so red. I looked down, and through the mirror, I could see a person's foot in one of the stalls. I froze. I stared at the bare foot, covered in cuts and bruises and dirt. It was so pale and skinny, almost inhumanly so. There was so much dirt under the toenails. It just looked gross. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. Slowly, I tried to approach the door, to leave, when I heard a woman's voice speak.
What are you doing in the woods at this time, my dear?
I couldn't breathe or speak. I think I was in shock or something, because I literally couldn't do anything. The woman then said,
Let us play a game, shall we?
I looked to the stall to see the horrid, ugly foot take a step forward.
Let's play. Would you rather, my child?
The stall clicked open. My throat closed. I quite literally couldn't breathe.
Would you rather die in the woods or die right here?
My body suddenly activated. I opened the door and ran so fast. I was racing through the trees. I lost my shoes and my feet were getting shredded by the branches and the thorns, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get back to the tent. I'm not sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I heard that woman laughing very subtly. I finally saw my tent, and I opened the zipper and pounced inside. My heart felt as if it was going to explode. My friend and her brother stayed fast asleep, but I could not sleep that night, nor the night after. That was the scariest night of my life, and that definitely wasn't human. My cat and I almost died. From Gatorpuppet. After dropping out of college and moving out, I got my hands on a phone. This was around the time when texting and cameras were improving by the year, so it was very exciting to me. I live out in the country, and the nearest neighbor is about a mile away, and the road ends to a forest about 500 yards from my house, so the house was very secluded. I have a cat named Callie. Callie is a hunter and is more active at night. She mostly stays on my porch because frogs like to jump out in the light, allowing my cat to, well, you get the idea. On my porch is a metal table surrounded by some wooden chairs and a swing. After all, it wouldn't really be the country without a porch swing. One night I was staying up texting my friend about available jobs around the area when I heard the table begin to vibrate. I look out the window next to me to see my cat on the table. I thought it was funny, then leaned over and took a picture. I sent it to my friend, wondering if he would find it humorous. "Dude, did you get another cat? I totally see some eyes under that swing." You ever feel what it's like going down a roller coaster? The feeling of your insides in free fall. That's how I felt, alongside shivers along my neck, and the blood withdrawn from the surface of my skin, leaving me cold. I took a look at the photo, and sure enough, I saw 2 white dots right under my swing. My cat then began to hiss and go haywire. I didn't want to look outside in fear of what I'd see, but Callie was out there, with whatever that thing might be. I peeped out the blinds to see not white, but dark yellow eyes fixating on my cat, who then began to run off the other direction. I jumped and knocked over a comb on the end of the couch I was laying on. As if it knew I was looking, those eyes darted right at me. I couldn't budge. If I moved, then it might think I'm dangerous, my instincts told me. But my body wanted to run and find my cat to protect her. Within these few seconds of our eyes focused on each other, waiting for the next move, it went first. The eyes went from 2 feet in height, all the way up to 8. The shivers grew more as my torso started to shake, and then a low hum was heard by both of us. A car. I then saw a beam of light hit the top of the trees of the forest and work its way down until it was illuminated. Black, messy fur and a dark gray chest, legs bent back and long arms that reached its kneecaps, if you can call them that. But the creepiest part was its head. It had the head of a wolf or dog, but its eyes and eyelashes looked more like they belonged on a human. Its ears ended with fur, and much of its teeth were more human-like too. I saw those teeth when it began to snarl. It growled low and loud enough for me to feel it. As soon as I saw this, it bolted away. It got on all fours and ran the entire 500 yards in what seemed to be less than 10 seconds. Turns out some hunters came late at night to repair some hunting stand they owned. But I think they saw it too, and quickly stepped on the brakes. They pulled into my gravel driveway and asked if I had some coyotes living in the area. I was still in shock of what happened, and my jaw was shaking. I couldn't speak. He then just came right out and said it. "That, wasn't no coyote, was it?" He then told me how his father saw something darting around in his backyard, and then he caught a glimpse of it. He then described the exact same thing I saw. That's what I saw," I replied in a shaky voice. He then went on back to his truck and drove on out of here. I went back inside with the phone blown up with messages of my friend asking if I was there. Callie retired at my door, demanding to be let in. I immediately got her inside. I knew right then what I saw looked like a werewolf. At the time, I was debating whether or not the supernatural was real, but I can now guarantee that it is. I'm just glad my cat is safe, and that Hunter decided to head back home, and I get to live another day. She followed me. From tjsauers. This story happened in Burns, Oregon. One year I was elk hunting with my dad and family. I wasn't really hunting myself, I was just tagging along. At the time I was only about 8 or 9 years old. I had a crossbow that just shot small sharp darts. We drove along a road until we found a spot to get out and walk. I stayed in the back of the truck, sitting there and eating some snacks. Eventually, I got bored and decided to go out and walk too. I grabbed my crossbow and hopped out. I walked for what felt like 20 seconds. Eventually, I got to this open cliff area. There was such an eerie feeling there. Just then, I heard something in the bushes, like something about to come after me. But, of all things, my aunt walked out from behind a tree. She said to me in such a weird way,
"Don't wander off by yourself."
The weird thing was, she had walked off with my family to go hunting in the opposite direction a long time ago at that point, and she hadn't made a sound until she exited those bushes. I lost sight of her on the walk back. I waited at the truck for my family to get back, and when they did, my aunt was with them. It was the strangest thing. I wonder what happened that day. Was it really my aunt that found me in the woods and disappeared, only to come back later with the rest of the family, never speaking a word of it? Or was it something else? I don't know what it was. From Jesse Jinx 13. These events took place over the course of about a month in the summer of 2017, in a trailer park in Parsonsburg, Maryland. I'd been down on my luck and recently found myself homeless, while my aunt was trying to convince her fiancé at the time to let me stay with them. Luckily, one of their neighbors was nice enough to let me stay with her. She was a very nice older woman, and only asked that I help with chores while staying there. One night, I think the third night I was staying there, the woman came out of her room to ask if I was knocking on the wall. She said she had been hearing knocks in a pattern of 3 at a time. I hadn't heard anything, and I told her as much. About 30 minutes later, from around the open kitchen in the window, I heard what sounded like heavy footsteps outside. They sounded oddly loud for being on dirt, but I decided to put it out of my mind. About an hour later, from outside the window behind the couch I was sitting at, I heard what sounded like the noise the aliens from Signs made. My family had me watch that movie when I was about 6, and ever since it's always creeped me out. So, feeling creeped out, I decided to move to the other couch across the room. The noises continued until I eventually fell asleep a few hours later. When I woke up around 7 in the morning, the noises were still going on. Nothing else happened for the few days I stayed with my aunt's neighbor. When my aunt's fiancé at the time was finally okay with me staying with them, I moved on over. It was a few weeks later when the next occurrence of something weird happened in that trailer park. My aunt had a black lab and would let him out right before she goes to bed and put him on a runner. She'd wait out there while he did his business. I would occasionally hang out with her while she waited for the dog, because I really only like the outdoors at night in the summertime. One night while we were waiting, I noticed the dog was standing as still as a statue. He was just staring at the tree line of the woods that surrounded the trailer park on 3 sides. I decided to look where he was staring, as this was unusual for him. What I saw was jarring to me. I do believe in most legends, as there's definitely things we as humans cannot explain out there. I just never expected to encounter something like this myself. What I saw was a tall, lanky, emaciated, bald, and pale figure leaning out from behind a tree. The nearby streetlight cast a hue on it, making it look almost gray in coloration. And using the trailer near the tree line as a judge of height, the top of its head was even with the top of the trailer. Its eyes just looked like dark voids, and I couldn't make out a nose on it. Its mouth was closed with a neutral-looking expression. As it stared at us, with the dog and I staring back, I began to feel an intense anger growing inside me, but something made me think it was causing it, as if it wanted me to charge at it. I told my aunt we needed to get inside, and I told her we needed to keep a hold of the dog's collar when we let him off the leash, so he won't go charging after the thing. We managed to get inside with no problem, and shortly after, my aunt went to bed. Unusually, that night the dog decided to sleep on the floor in front of the couch I was sleeping at, instead of my aunt and her then fiancé's room. Then, as I was about to fall asleep, I began to hear something messing with the doorknob on the front door. It sounded like someone was trying to open it, but it was either unfamiliar with how doorknobs work, or it couldn't actually grip the doorknob. After about a minute of trying, it stopped. The next day, my aunt was outside playing with one of her kids, while the baby was asleep and her oldest was doing homework, when she suddenly came back inside with a very uncomfortable look on her face. She told me while she was out there, a small rock went flying past her face, after which she heard a growling sound that seemed to originate from right next to her ear. Her kid apparently heard it too, so she ushered him inside quickly. After this, I decided to order some sage and sweetgrass to attempt to cleanse the house to see if it might help. After it arrived, I was researching cleansing rituals because I wanted to get it right the first time. But before I could actually perform the cleansing, the sage and sweetgrass both vanished from where I'd been keeping them. I would have seen someone messing with them. They were right next to the rest of my things under the corner table, between the 2 couches in the living room. After a couple of weeks of nothing else weird happening, I wound up moving somewhere else, and I have no idea if anything else happened, as my aunt and her now ex wound up separating soon after. I don't know if any of the experiences were linked in any way, but I suspect they were. If anyone knows what this was, I'd appreciate the info.